Many of us are a fan of the long tail cast on, but not a fan of having to estimate the amount of yarn needed for the tail. So nothing worse than casting on hundreds of stitches and realizing for the last few your tail is too short, or the opposite, we've had a really long tail and we have way too much left over and wasted a lot of yarn. So we can still cast on with the long tail method and not estimate the tail yarn in a couple of different ways. The first way is using 2 skeins of yarn. So this is perfect when you're casting on hundreds of stitches, say for a blanket, and you'll be using it's a multi-skein project. So you'll just grab 2 of your skeins of yarn and you'll start by making a slip knot, one using an end from each of your skeins of yarn. Now you just make a regular slip knot and put it on your needle. We don't need to worry how long this tail is because we're just going to weave those ends in later. This double slip knot is not part of our stitch count and we're not going to be knitting it. So before I begin, I like to clip on a marker to remind me not to count those and not to knit them. So once that's done, I can start casting on just the regular long tail method, except the difference is one skein is going to be our thumb yarn and one is going to be our forefinger yarn. If you've never done this cast on, I'd recommend watching my long tail video cast on. So I'm just going to go ahead and set my hands up as usual and begin casting on. So I'm not going to cast on a whole bunch of stitches just so you can see how this works. So let's pretend that that's all the number of stitches that I need to cast on. So it's time to start knitting. So what I need to do is cut the yarn from one of my skeins. So I'll go ahead and you just want to cut it long enough that you can weave that in. And then I'm just going to be knitting with one skein of yarn. So I'm going to go ahead and knit, start my first row of knitting, working my way to that double slip knot. Now that I'm at the double slip knot, I had my little reminders. I'm just going to let that fall off, and as scary as it seems, nothing will really happen. You can unclip that, pull that out, and now you're ready to continue to knit. So the only difference with this method is we have a few extra tails to weave in. So let me show you how we would do that from one skein. I'll get these 2 out of the way. So let's see if we wanted to cast on just from one skein. Let's say you had a really fine cashmere and you didn't want to waste an inch of it. So we can do the same method with one skein. We will use the end of the yarn from the outside of the ball and from the inside of it. So same as before, we will just make a double slip knot, except this time it's the strand from the inside of the skein and from the outside. So once we have our double slip knot, we will go ahead and clip it with a marker. And then over our hands, we will have the strand from the inside of the skein and from the outside. Cast down a few stitches here, so that's all as usual. And then you will turn, and before you knit, you will cut the end from either the inside or the outside, doesn't really matter. And then you can go ahead and keep knitting. So same thing, you will knit to the double slip knot. And once you get there, just drop that off just as before. Happy knitting!